A lone cowboy found a little girl chained to a post with a sign that said, "No one's." The chain was logging chain. Not the light stuff they use for leading horses, but the heavy kind, iron links the size of a grown man's thumb, the sort that holds a 2-ton log to a skidder. Somebody had gone and found that chain and wrapped it 3 times around the base of the post and twice around the child's ankle, and then they'd padlocked it with a lock that cost more than the dress she was wearing. I know because I priced that padlock later when I had occasion. The sign was a piece of flour sack. Someone had written on it in charcoal, pressing hard, "No one's 2 words." The apostrophe was careful, deliberate, like the person who made it had learned their letters from a schoolmaster who valued precision, which told me something about the cruelty involved, that the person had thought long enough about the grammar to get it right. She was maybe 4 years old, maybe 5, small enough that the chain weighed more than she did, which meant she couldn't stand all the way up. She was crouching against the post the way animals crouch when they've been in a small space too long, all her weight on the balls of her feet, her arms wrapped around the wood, her cheek pressed to it like the post was the thing keeping her warm. The post was not keeping her warm. It was November. I had come off the Cimarron Road, looking for a place to winter over. I'd been 3 months moving cattle for a man named Aldous Gregg up near Dodge, and the season was done, and I had $40 and a horse I'd earned and nowhere particular to be. The town of Garnett, Kansas was not a town I'd sought out or heard of. I came into it because the weather had turned and the road split, and I took the left fork because it looked like it went somewhere. It went to a feed lot, a dry goods, a barber shop, a church with a bell tower, and a livery with a painted sign that read Garvey and Son, HORSES, boarded and shod. The post the child was chained to was right there on the main street, in front of the dry goods, like a notice board. People were walking past her. Not like they didn't see, they saw. A woman in a green coat looked down at her and then looked away and walked faster. A man in a hat came out of the barber shop and stepped around the chain without breaking stride. 2 boys, maybe 12 or 13, stood across the street watching her the way boys watch something they can't decide whether to be cruel about. They hadn't decided yet. I sat my horse in the middle of that street for a while. The child hadn't looked up when I rode in. She had her face against the post, and I wasn't sure she knew I was there, except that the chain clinked once, soft, like she'd shifted her weight or like she was trembling. I got down. My horse, a gray gelding I called Dex, had no opinion about any of it. He stood where I left him and watched me walk toward the post. When I got close enough, I could see the girl was shaking. Not crying. Shaking. The kind of shaking that's been going on so long it isn't about being cold anymore, it's just what the body does when it's given up on protesting. Her hair was dark, matted on one side like she'd slept on the ground. Her dress was too thin for November, and it had a tear along the hem somebody had tried to mend with different thread. The mending was neat. Someone had loved this child enough to mend her dress. Then someone had chained her to a post in front of a dry goods store in Garnett, Kansas, and written "No Once" on a flour sack and hung it around her neck. I crouched down next to her. She still didn't look at me. She had a particular kind of stillness that I recognized from certain animals that have been hurt in certain ways. Not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of a thing that has learned that moving doesn't help. I said quietly, "I'm going to sit here a minute if that's all right." "Nothing. My name is Cal Bauer," I said. "I just rode in from the north." The chain clinked, she shifted. After a moment not looking at me, she said, "There's a lock." Her voice was hoarse, like she'd been crying a long time and then stopped. "I see it," I said. "Man from the store has the key," she said. "He says he's going to sell me to whoever pays for me, but nobody wants to buy me." She said it the way a child says a thing they've heard so many times it stopped having meaning. The way they say there are 12 inches in a foot, or the sun rises in the east. I looked at the dry goods store. Through the window I could see a man behind a counter, tallish, wearing a white apron, watching me. He had a beard that was trimmed close on the sides and longer in the middle, and the look of a man who believed he was owed more than life had given him. I stood up, I went into the store. The bell above the door rang when I entered, which I found obscene given the circumstance. The man in the apron said, "Help you." I said, "The child." He said, "What about her?" I said, "Whose child is she?" He said, "Read the sign." There were 2 other men in the store. One was browsing canned goods. One was sitting on a barrel near the stove doing nothing at all, just sitting there the way men sit when they've nowhere else to go. Neither of them looked up. "I read the sign," I said. "I want to know who put her there." "Her mother," the man said. He said it like it was the simplest thing in the world, and he was being patient with me for not understanding. "Woman came through 3 weeks back, said she couldn't feed her, couldn't keep her. Left her with me, and said whoever wanted her could have her for the cost of the board I'd provided while I had her." "The board?" "Fed her," he said, "out of Christian charity, while I waited for someone to take her on, somebody who could use a girl that age around a place. There are families that need that." I looked at him for a moment. The man by the stove shifted on his barrel. The one browsing canned goods put down a tin of peaches and picked up a tin of beans. I said, "What's the cost of the board?" He named a figure. It was not a small figure. It was the kind of figure that doubled what it cost every few days, the kind of mathematics that keep people poor and keep store owners comfortable. I counted it out of my $40. I put the money on the counter. I said, "The key." He looked at the money, he looked at me. He said, "You're not a family." "Key," I said. Something happened in his face. Not shame. Just a recalibration, the way a man looks when he's decided the argument isn't worth the money. He reached under the counter and put the key down next to the bills. I took the key. I left the store. I went back to the post and unlocked the padlock and unwound the chain. I had to lift it over her foot because the links had stiffened in the cold and wouldn't slide. Her ankle where the chain had been was chafed raw and there was dried blood in a line around it. When the chain came off, she didn't move, still crouching, still holding the post. I said, "It's off." She slowly turned her head and looked at the ankle. Then she looked at me. She had gray eyes, very pale, the kind of gray that's almost silver, and there was something in them that was older than a 5-year-old child has any right to have. Not hurt, exactly. Something past hurt. The place you get to when hurt has been going on long enough that you stop organizing your experience around it. I said, "I'm going to pick you up, all right?" She nodded just once. I picked her up. She was light as I'd feared. She put one arm around my neck, tentative, like she wasn't sure of the permission. I carried her to the livery. I paid for a stall for Dex and a room in the loft for me, and I asked the livery man, a broad, quiet fellow named Porter who had a son about 15 working alongside him, whether there was a woman in town who might look after a child for a day or two. He gave me a long look. Then he told me about a woman named Mrs. Alcott who took in laundry and had a soft heart and lived 3 houses down from the church. I carried the child to Mrs. Alcott's. The woman opened the door and saw us and didn't ask a single question before she opened the door wider and took the girl from my arms. She put her hand flat against the child's forehead and cheeked the way women do, and said something soft I couldn't hear and carried her inside. Before the door closed, I heard the child say something, just 2 words. She said, "Nora, Nora." I stopped. I said through the closing door, "That her name, Nora?" Mrs. Alcott looked at me over the child's head. She said, "I think that's her mama's name." I stood on that porch for a while after the door closed. Then I went and found a place to get a meal, and I sat and ate, and thought about a woman named Nora who had come through this town 3 weeks ago and left her child chained to a post. I thought about the mended dress, about the neat stitching with the mismatched thread, about a woman who had loved her child enough to mend her dress and had still left her chained to a post in November in a town called Garnett, Kansas. I thought about those 2 things together and what they added up to. They added up to a woman who hadn't chosen to leave. I'm not a detective. I was never a lawman. I have worked cattle since I was 17, and I have slept more nights under the sky than under a roof, and my opinions about the nature of people are based on observation rather than philosophy. But I have been alive long enough to know the difference between a woman who abandons her child and a woman who deposits her child somewhere safe because the alternative is worse. The difference is the mending. A woman who doesn't care doesn't mend the dress. I finished my meal. I went back to the dry goods store. I went in again and the bell rang again and the man in the apron was still behind the counter, and this time I asked him about Nora. He went still when I said the name. It was a particular kind of still. The kind that is itself a piece of information. He said, "What about her?" I said, "Where did she go?" He said, "Don't know what you're talking about." I looked around the store. The man on the barrel was still there. The man with the canned goods was gone. There was a woman at the back picking through bolts of fabric, not looking at us. I said, "The woman who left the child. Her name was Nora. Where is she?" He said, "She moved on, that's all." I said, "Moved on where?" He said, "Mister, I got a store to run." I said, "I'm not in a hurry." There was a quiet in the store then that had some weight to it. The man on the barrel coughed. The woman at the back with the fabric became very interested in a bolt of brown wool. The man in the apron said, "You'd do well to move on yourself." I said I probably would. I left. I went to the barber shop because barbershops are where you learn things. I sat in the chair and let a man named Vic, who smelled of bay rum and was chattier than most, cut my hair and take a quarter-inch off my beard, and while he was doing it, I listened. He told me about the weather, about a dispute over water rights on the east side of the county, about the new family that had bought the old Henderson's place. He told me about the dry goods man, whose name was Greer, and how Greer was on the town council, and how Greer was also a deacon in the church, and how Greer and the reverend of that church, a man named Aldous Cade, were close as brothers. I said, casual, "I saw a child chained out front of Greer's place when I rode in." Vic's scissors slowed. He said, "Yeah." I said, "Struck me as unusual." He said, "Child's been placed now, I understand." I said, "The mother, she's still around." He stopped cutting entirely. He met my eyes in the mirror. He was a man around 50 with a face that had made peace with a lot of things it would rather not have made peace with. The kind of face that peace has not come easily to, that has lines in it from looking away from things you knew you should have looked at. He said, "You should ask that question somewhere else." I said, "Where else?" He picked his scissors back up. He said, "There isn't anywhere else, you best understand that." I paid him and left. I went to the feed lot next. It was at the south end of town, away from the church and the dry goods and the respectable face of Garnet, and feed lots are democratic places. They take all kinds and they smell the same regardless of a man standing. I spent an hour there asking about feed prices and road conditions north toward the Platte, the routine questions of a man looking to winter over or pass through. The men working the scales were plain-faced and sun-worn, the kind of men you find in feed operations everywhere, and they talked easily about neutral things: the hay shortage east of the county, the trail conditions through the breaks, which route held water in November. The moment anything touched Cade or the church or a missing woman, the talk dried up as completely as if a valve had been shut. I watched that valve get shut twice and I noted the speed of it. Not reluctant, not gradual, immediate, practiced. These were men who had been careful for a long time. On the way back I passed the church. White clapboard, bell tower, the cross on top recently painted and the paint still bright against the November sky. A good-looking building from the outside, the kind that takes donations and volunteer labor and reflects both back as evidence of righteousness. The door was open. I walked in. The interior was dim and cold, the November light coming in gray through tall windows. The pews were good wood, plain and solid, well kept. Someone swept this place regularly. Someone oiled the woodwork. There was a smell of candle wax and something underneath it that I couldn't name for a moment and then named. Damp wool, the smell of many people sitting in one space over a long time, the compressed record of a congregation gathered and dismissed, until the smell of them had soaked into the walls. At the front of the church, a man was standing at the pulpit with a Bible open, not reading from it but resting one hand on the page, looking out at the empty pews as if rehearsing the sight of a congregation. Or as if he could see one, as if the empty pews were not empty to him. He was slim, tall, narrow in the shoulders, long fingers as I'd observed before. His face was regular, not unkind-looking, which was somehow worse than if it had been. He had the look of a man who had convinced himself of something a long time ago and had not revisited the conviction since. There are men whose certainty came from suffering, from hard-won experience, from the kind of life that burns off everything unnecessary and leaves what's true. This was not that kind of certainty. His sat in him the way stone sits in a field, doesn't move, doesn't consider moving, is simply there, and has been there long enough that the ground has shaped itself around it, that the grass has learned to grow around it rather than argue with it. He looked at me when I came in. He was not surprised to see me. I don't think many things surprised him. He said, "Traveler." I said, "Reverend." He said, "Come in and rest." "You're welcome here." I said, "I won't be long." I came down the center aisle a few paces and stopped. The sound of my boots on the wood floor was the only sound. "I wanted to ask you about a woman, name of Nora. She came through your town 3 weeks back." He considered me. His hand stayed on the Bible page. I noticed the hand. It was entirely still. He said, "We see a good many travelers." I said she had a child, girl named Macy. The girl was left in Mr. Greer's care. He said, "I recall something of that. A woman in difficult circumstances. We tried to help." I said, "Where is she now?" He said, "She moved on, as people in her situation do." I said, "What situation is that?" He said, "A woman without a husband, without resources, without, one might say, a stable moral footing." He closed the Bible slowly and deliberately, the way a man closes a thing he controls. "We tried to offer guidance. She chose her own path." I said, "Her own path?" He said, "We can only do so much." I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at me with perfect equanimity, the kind that comes from long practice at looking at men who know things and deciding that what they know doesn't matter because the power is arranged in his favor. He was not afraid of me. He saw no reason to be. In Garnett, Kansas, he had never had reason to be afraid of a man who walked into his church with questions, because the men who walked in with questions walked out again and kept their mouths shut and eventually moved on. He was not thinking about whether I would move on. He was thinking about the next Sunday's sermon, or the next thing the world owed him. I said, "I see." I turned and walked back up the aisle and out the door into the cold. Behind me, the door swung shut with a sound that echoed in the empty church, once, and then was swallowed. I spent the rest of that day and the next morning watching Garnett. I have a talent for this, for going still and watching, that I developed young and have never had occasion to unlearn. I watched who went where and who spoke to whom and who avoided whom. I watched the Reverend Cade, who moved through this town the way water moves when it's found all the channels, everywhere always without effort, taking the path of least resistance because it had long since shaped itself for him. 2 men from the town council came to the church early in the morning and stayed an hour. The county sheriff rode in at midday, went to Greer's store, came out 20 minutes later, rode south. They had the easy familiarity of men who have an arrangement so established that they no longer think about it. On the second morning, I was at the livery, helping Porter's son with a mare that had stone bruise when a woman came in the side door. She moved the way water moves in a narrow channel, fast, close to the wall, looking to stay unobserved. She was slight, with dark hair pulled back tight, and the kind of face that would be remarkable if it weren't for the careful flatness she'd put on it. The expression of a woman who has learned that attracting notice is a form of danger. She stopped when she saw me. I stayed where I was with the mare's left foreleg up on my knee and looked at her and waited. She looked at the mare, she looked at the door she'd come in, she looked at me. She said, "Are you the one who paid for Macy?" I said, "If the child's name is Macy, then yes." Something went through her that she tried not to show. It went through anyway. She put one hand flat against the wall of the livery and just stood there a moment with her eyes closed. And in that moment, the careful flatness came off her face entirely, and what was underneath it was a mother who had spent 3 weeks not knowing. She opened her eyes. The flatness came back, not all the way, but enough. She said, "They told me she'd been taken on by a farm family east of here. They said she'd be put to work." I said, "Who told you that?" She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were the same pale gray as the child's. Now that I was close enough, I could see that one side of her jaw was a little uneven, the kind of thing that happens when something is broken and heals slightly wrong. I could see she was thin in a way that had an edge of permanence to it, the kind of thin that isn't from missing a few meals but from a longer privation. She said, "You're not from here." I said, "No." She said, "Then you don't understand how things work here." I put the mare's foot down gently and straightened up and turned to face her. I said, "Why don't you tell me?" She didn't answer right away. She was watching me with the assessment of someone who has been betrayed by trust enough times that it has become a tool they only use sparingly. She was measuring me against some internal standard I couldn't see the specifications of. Porter's boy had gone quiet in the next stall. Kids that age, they know when the adult air changes. Finally, she said, "There's a man." "The Reverend." She said it the way you say the name of a natural disaster. Not a person, a condition. Cade, I said. Her head moved slightly, not a nod, an acknowledgement like she was surprised I had the name. She said he has an arrangement with Greer with most of the men on the council. They move through this county like, she stopped. She said, when I came through here I had my daughter, I was trying to get north. I had kin in Nebraska. I stopped because the horse threw a shoe and Greer's store was where I went for nails and he saw Macy and he told Cade. She stopped again. Cade said I owed a debt. That I had sinned and there was a debt and Macy would be how I paid it. I said, what kind of debt? She looked at me then with an expression that was so completely done with the requirement to explain certain things to people who had never had to know them that I didn't push the question. I said, where have you been for 3 weeks? She said, Cade's house. I said, against your will. She said, there is no against your will in this town. There's just what happens. I said, where is his house? Her eyes changed. She said, don't. I said, I'm just asking. She said, men who ask that question don't come back. I've been difficult to kill before, I said. It's a personal failing. She stared at me. I think she was waiting for the lie to surface in my face. It didn't surface because it wasn't there. She said, why? I said, because your daughter called your name when I carried her to the Alcott Woman's. She said, Nora, that's all, just that. Nora put her hand flat against the wall again. She looked at the dirt floor of the livery. She stood like that for a long time, or what felt like a long time, though it was probably 30 seconds. Then she said, the big house at the end of Ridley Road, white fence, pine trees in front. I said, thank you. She said, you'll need. I said, I'll manage. She said, there are 3 men besides him. They're not. I said, I understand. She said, he has an arrangement with the county sheriff. There's no law here that will help you. I said, I heard that. She said, then why are you? I said, because you came into this livery to find out about your daughter. That took courage. And because someone mended her dress carefully before they left her. And because there isn't anyone else. Nora looked at me for a moment with those pale eyes. She said, you don't know me. I said, no, but I know the dress was mended. She was quiet. I said, I'm going to ask you to go to Mrs. Alcott's. I'm going to ask you to stay there with Macy until I come. If I'm not there by nightfall, take the girl and go north. Don't wait for morning. She said, my horse is at the livery on the east side of town, not this one. Greer paid the fee 3 weeks ago, the horse is still mine. They probably think I don't know where it is. A pause. It's a bay, 16 hands, fast. I said, all right. She looked at me one more time. She said, what kind of man does this? I said, the available kind. That wasn't the whole truth, but it was part of it. The rest of the truth was that I had lived my life moving across the face of the land and had made a practice of keeping my head down because keeping your head down is how you survive. I had seen things in 30 years of drifting that I had kept my head down about and ridden away from, and I was not sorry for most of those decisions because most of them were survival, and survival is not the same as cowardice. But the chain, those iron links, the weight of them against a child's ankle. There is a line somewhere that a man draws, or ought to draw, and I had been writing for 30 years without quite finding mine, and now I had found it, and it was a logging chain around a 5-year-old child's ankle in November in Garnett, Kansas. That is the rest of the truth. I went to the Ridley Road house that afternoon. I will not tell it in detail because detail is not the point, and because there are things that don't need to be preserved in the telling. There were 3 men besides Cade, and I was right that they weren't easy. I will tell you that I have worked physical labor my whole life, and that I have twice the patience of most men, and that I chose my approach rather than going in blind, that I watched the house an hour before I moved, and I knew where the men were, and I came in from the north side where the pine trees gave cover, and I was not in a hurry. I will tell you it took most of the afternoon, and I broke 2 ribs, cracked 1 more, took a cut along my left forearm that needed stitching, lost a tooth that I wasn't particularly attached to. I will tell you that by the time I came out the front door of that White House, Cade was secured to the porch railing with his own good rope, and his 3 men were in various states of difficulty inside, and that when Cade looked at me secured to that railing with his long fingers and his careful hands and his Bible page precision, he had nothing to say, which was interesting. In my experience, a man who has nothing to say when things go against him is a man who has never in his adult life needed words when he had men to do the work that words couldn't. Take the men away, and there's very little left. I looked at him for a moment. I said, there's going to be a conversation. But it'll be with someone other than me. I meant I'd sent word ahead to a county judge in Wichita, which I'd done that morning, on the theory that even a county with a corrupted sheriff answers eventually to something higher. I didn't know if it would work. I knew it was the best option available. I left him on the porch. I went to the East Side livery and paid the board on the bay horse and led her through town to Mrs. Alcott's. Nora came to the door when I knocked. She looked at me for a moment, the blood on my shirt, the eye that was swelling, the way I was holding my left side. She said, I told you. I said, you did. She said, come inside. Mrs. Alcott had hot water and clean cloth, and she was generous with both without asking a single question that wasn't practical. She was that rare kind of woman who meets a situation and addresses the situation without requiring a full account of the prior events. She worked on the cut on my arm with a steadiness and skill that suggested she had done this before, and her hands were sure, and the stitching she put in was neater than what a doctor in Dodge had done for me 3 years prior. Macy sat on a stool by the stove and watched me. She had been fed and her hair had been combed, and somebody had found her a pair of thick wool stockings that were too big but were warm. She watched me with those pale gray eyes while Mrs. Alcott worked. After a while, Macy said, you went to get Mama. I said, I did. She said, why? I said, because she's your mama. She thought about this. She said, she left me. I said, she left you safe. There's a difference. Macy looked at her mother for a moment, then back at me with the complex assessment of a small child who is working out whether to believe something. Then she got down from the stool and came and stood next to where I was sitting and put her small hand on my knee and leaned against my arm. Not asking, not demanding. Just there. I did not know what to do with that. I have no children. I have lived alone for a long time. I sat very still. Nora was watching from across the room with an expression I couldn't fully read. There was something in it that was not quite grief and not quite gratitude. Something that comes before both of those things and is quieter than either. We left Garnet the next morning before the county sheriff could arrive to assess the situation at the Ridley Road house. I paid Mrs. Alcott from what remained of my $40, and she accepted it without making it a thing. As I was going out the door, she took my arm briefly and said, come back through if you're ever this way. She was looking at me when she said it the way people look at you when they mean something more than the words. I nodded, and we went. I led the bay and rode decks. Nora rode the bay with Macy in front of her, the girl's back against her mother's chest, Nora's arms around her. We went north. I had no fixed plan. North was enough of a plan. She had kin in Nebraska, that was north. I had nothing pulling me south or east or west, so north it was. The first day we made good time. The country was rolling flat with the sky big above it the way Kansas sky gets, going on forever in every direction, a hard pale blue with high thin cloud moving south. My ribs hurt with every footfall from decks, and I learned to sit in a way that absorbed some of it, leaning slightly right, and I did not mention it. Macy, it turned out, was not a small child who suffered silence badly. She had her mother's self-possession, and she could ride hours without complaint. On the first afternoon, she informed me from her position in front of Nora that my horse was favoring his left front, and that I should check the hoof. And I checked, and there was a small stone pressed up against the frog that I might have found by morning but might not have. And I looked at her, and she looked back at me with those gray eyes that were entirely too old for her face, and said nothing further. I pried the stone out with my knife and set Dex back on the road, and as we rode on I thought about a 5-year-old child who had spent 2 days chained to a post and could still be that careful about a horse's foot. There was something in that I couldn't name, but that I respected. At night we made small fires in the shelter of whatever the country offered, a cut bank, a stand of cottonwood, once the lee side of a collapsed sod structure that had been someone's attempt at a homestead and was now 4 low walls returning to the ground. I cooked, and Nora managed Macy and the horses between them. We divided the work without discussion, which is the way you find out if a person is practical or if they're performing practicality. She was practical in the bone-deep way that comes from necessity, sustained long enough that it stops being effort and just becomes how a person moves through the world. She noticed what needed doing and did it, and didn't make a matter of it. Macy helped with the horses in the evening, carrying the water bucket and holding the lead ropes while her mother checked their feet, and she took both tasks seriously. She was not a child who performed seriousness. She simply had it. On the second evening, she told me with the air of a person correcting a minor error before it becomes a habit, that I was banking the fire too flat and it would be out by midnight. I built it up the way she indicated. She was right. It was still going when I woke at 3 to check it. I mentioned this to no one, but I thought about it. Nora and I talked some in the evenings. Not about Garnet, not right away. We talked about the country, about the route, about weather signs. She had come west from Missouri originally, and before that from somewhere in Ohio. She had an education that showed around the edges of her talk, the way it does with people who have read more than the people around them knew. She was precise, careful. She said what she meant and didn't say more than she meant. On the second night, the fire low between us, Macy asleep in the bedroll, she told me about her husband. His name had been Thomas. He had been a farmer in Missouri, a good one, careful with his land and his animals and with her. The fever had taken him 4 years ago in the spring, and she had tried to keep the farm and had lasted 2 years before she couldn't keep it anymore. She had sold what she could and taken Macy and gone west, because west was where you went when the east was used up. She said it all flatly, without self-pity, the way you report the weather. I said, he sounds like a man worth grieving. She said he was. She looked at the fire. He'd have done what you did, paid for the child, gone to find me. She paused. He'd have gotten himself killed for it, most likely. He was brave, but he wasn't. She stopped. I said, wasn't what? She said, wasn't the kind of man who'd done it before. I said nothing. She said, you've done this before, not the same thing, but you know how to move through difficulty without being destroyed by it. I said, mostly. She said, that's what I mean, mostly. She looked at me across the fire. Most people don't have a mostly. They have either never or always, and neither one teaches you anything useful. I said, you have a mostly. She said, I'm still here. On the third night, the cold came down harder, and we camped in the shelter of a dry creek bank that blocked most of the wind. I built the fire bigger, and Macy slept between Nora and the fire with her blanket pulled over her ear and didn't stir. Nora and I sat up longer than usual because the wind was unsettling in the way strong wind is, pressing at you, asking you to account for yourself. She said after a long silence, I kept thinking while I was at that house, I kept thinking about the dress, the mending I'd done on it. She was looking at her hands. I thought if she's out there and she can see that the hem is mended, she'll know I thought about her. Even if she couldn't understand why I left her, she'd know I thought about her enough to. She stopped. She breathed. It's a foolish thing to hold on to. I said, it's not foolish. She said, she's 5. I said, she's not the one who needed to know. She looked at me. I said, you needed to know that you'd thought about her, that you'd done what you could with what you had. The dress was for you as much as her. A long quiet. The wind pushed at the top of the creek bank above us and went on. She said, that's a generous reading. I said, it's an honest one. She looked at the fire for a while. Then she said, I didn't think anyone was going to come. I said, I know. She said, I want you to know that I wasn't. She stopped. She started again. When I came into that livery, I wasn't looking to be rescued. I came because I needed to know where Macy was. I needed to know she was alive. I said, I know that too. She said, then what you said about coming to find me, that wasn't. I said, I know what it was. I was there. She was quiet a moment. Then something in her settled, some arrangement she'd been holding in place relaxed by a degree. She said, all right. On the 4th morning, the country changed. Kansas had been brown and flat, and the sky had been a great empty dome above it. And then we crossed into Nebraska, and the land began to fold a little, nothing dramatic, just small rises and breaks in the plain, and there were more trees along the watercourses, cottonwood mostly, the last of their leaves gone but the branches white against the sky in a way that was different from Kansas sky. The cold was the same cold. The road was the same road, but the country had a different temperament to it. Less exposed, something that wasn't quite shelter but was closer to it than what we'd been riding through. Macy, from her position in front of her mother, observed that Nebraska was greener than Kansas even in November and asked me why. I said it was the water table and the soil and the way the land held what came down from the sky instead of letting it run off. She thought about this and said that Kansas seemed wasteful. I said I didn't think Kansas was in charge of it. She said things should be in charge of themselves if they could. I said that was a reasonable position. Nora said nothing, but I heard the sound she made very quiet in her chest. Not a laugh. The sound that comes before a laugh or in place of one when the thing isn't quite funny, but it's the closest thing to funny that the day has offered. We found her kin in Nebraska late that afternoon. A farm north of a town called Hadley. A man named Rourke who was her mother's brother and who came out of the house when we rode up and took one look at Nora and Macy and put his hand over his eyes for a moment. That gesture men make when something they've been hoping for and afraid to hope for has just arrived in their yard. He shook my hand. He said, "Come in, please." I said, "I'll get the horses settled, and then I'll eat if you're offering." He said they were offering. I settled the horses. I took my time about it. My ribs were still bad, and the cold made them worse, and I was honest with myself about the fact that getting down from a horse was going to continue to be unpleasant for some weeks. I got Dex and the bay watered and fed and blanketed, and I let myself rest against the stall a while in the quiet of a warm barn with two good animals and the smell of hay, and I thought about nothing in particular. Just breathed. Just let the last week settle into its place behind me. When I came in the farmhouse, Nora had Macy on her lap at the kitchen table, and Macy was asleep against her shoulder with the complete bonelessness of a small child who has finally decided it is safe to sleep. Nora had her arm around her, and her cheek rested on top of the child's dark hair, and her eyes were closed, and she looked like a woman who has put something down that she has been carrying for a very long time. Rourke's wife put a plate in front of me without fanfare, and I ate. Later, when the child was put to bed and Rourke had gone to do a last check of his stock, Nora and I sat at the kitchen table with coffee. The lamp between us made a warm circle, and outside the wind had come up and was pushing at the house the way wind does in Nebraska, testing the corners, making sure the house knew it was there. She said, "Where do you go from here?" I said I hadn't thought past here. She said, "There's work on this farm. My uncle needs hands." I said, "Does he?" She said, "He'd pay fair." I said, "That's useful to know." She looked at her coffee cup. She said, "Macy would like it." I said, "I imagine she'd adjust either way. She's practical." She said she takes after her father in that regard. She paused. "He died 4 years ago, fever. We've been moving since." I said, "I know, you told me." She said, "I know I told you." She looked at her cup. "I was leading somewhere and I took too long getting there." I waited. She said, "What I'm saying is," she stopped. She looked at me directly. She was done being indirect about things. She had probably been done with indirection for a long time. "I'm saying that if you stayed, we would be glad of it, both of us. Macy because she trusts you, which doesn't come easily to her. And me," she paused again, "because I am a woman who makes careful assessments and my assessment of you is favorable." I said, "That is the most economical statement of that particular thing I have ever heard." Something happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, close. I said I'd have to earn my keep. I'm not a man who takes charity. She said, "I know that." I said, "And I'd want it known that I'm here in a proper capacity. This is a respectable household." She said, "My uncle is a deacon in the Methodist Church. You would be working for him. That's proper enough." I said, "All right." She looked at me for a moment more. Then she nodded, just once, the decisive nod of a woman who has made a decision and filed it away and moved on to the practical matters. She said, "There's a room off the barn. It's cold, but there's a stove. I can bring blankets." I said, "That'll do fine." She stood up and gathered the cups and set them on the counter. She was moving around the kitchen with the ease of someone who had grown up in kitchens, someone who could find her way around one in the dark. Then she stopped by the window and looked out at the dark of the yard for a moment. She said, without turning around, "My daughter called your name 3 times in her sleep tonight, before she went under." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. She turned and looked at me. The lamp between us, the window dark behind her, her face quiet and straight and not hiding anything. She said, "Cal." It was only my name, she just said it. But it was the way she said it, like a thing acknowledged, like a door decided upon, like the particular sound of a woman saying a man's name when she has chosen him without yet having said so in so many words. I said, I'll get those blankets. She said, I'll get them, you sit. I sat. Outside, the wind pushed at the corners of the house and found them solid. The lamp burned steady between my hands. I could hear, somewhere in the back of the house, the sound of a small child breathing in deep, untroubled sleep, which is one of the few sounds in this world that contains nothing but itself. I had $40 when I rode into Garnett, Kansas. I had less than 10 when I rode out. I had 2 cracked ribs and a cut that would scar and a tooth gone from the lower left. And I was sitting in a farmhouse kitchen in Nebraska in November with the wind coming up, and no money to speak of and more future than I'd had in a long time. The room off the barn was cold. The stove was small but good iron, and it drew well. Nora brought 3 blankets and a quilt, and when she handed them to me, her hand brushed mine and she didn't move it away immediately. She just stood there a moment, her hand over mine, both of us looking at the stove. She said, "Good night, Cal." I said, "Good night." She left. I banked the stove and put the quilt on the cot and sat for a while on the edge of it with my boots off and my hands between my knees, looking at the stove. In the morning, Macy found me before I'd gotten Dex watered. She came across the yard in those 2 big wool stockings with her hair loose and her breath in the cold air, and she said without preamble, "Mama says you're staying." I said, "For a while." She said, "For how long?" I said, "Don't know yet." She thought about this. She said, "A long time is better." I said, "Usually." She came and stood next to me at the trough and watched me work the pump handle. She said, "You have to put your back into it. The pump's stiff in the cold." I said, "I see that." She said, "My father used to let me help." I said, "You want to help?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Hold the bucket." She held the bucket. I worked the pump. The water came up cold and clear, and Dex put his nose in and drank, and Macy held the bucket with both hands and watched with great seriousness. Nora came to the doorway of the farmhouse and stood there in a coat that was too thin for the cold with her arms folded against her chest, watching us. The morning light was low and pale, and it caught the side of her face, and she was watching her daughter and me at the pump with an expression that had nothing complex in it. It was simple. It was a woman watching something that she has been afraid would never come, seeing it come. I looked up and caught her looking. She didn't look away. She lifted one hand in a small acknowledgement, not a wave, just a hand raised, just a moment held, and then she went back inside. I kept working the pump. Macy said, "She does that." I said, "Does what?" She said, "Watches, when she thinks nobody knows." I said, "I know." She said, "So why didn't you say anything?" I said, "Because some things don't need saying." Macy considered this with the expression of a child who is filing information away for later. She was going to be a formidable person. She already was. The water bucket was full. I set it down for the horse. The cold morning was very still around us, just the sound of the animal drinking and somewhere to the south a crow calling twice and then stopping. Macy set the bucket down carefully when Dex had finished, and then picked it up again and looked into the empty bottom of it the way children look at things that have been full and are now empty, as if the water's absence is interesting. She said, "Do we have to do this every morning?" I said, "Every morning." She said, "What about when it rains?" I said, "Same thing." She considered this. She said, "My father had a cistern. You didn't have to pump. It just held water from the rain." I said, "That's a good system." She said, "You could build one." I said, "I could try." She looked at me with the critical evaluation of a person who has seen a great many attempts and is assessing the probability of this particular one. She said, "Do you know how?" I said, "I know the general principle." She said, "That's not the same as knowing how." I said, "No, it's not." She handed me the bucket. She said, "You could find out." I said, "I probably could." She nodded. The matter was settled in her mind. She went toward the house, walking carefully in the 2 big stockings, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. At the door, she stopped and looked back at me. She said, "Mama makes coffee early, before everyone else. If you come before Rurkta, she'll give you some." Then she went inside. I stood in the yard with the empty bucket, and the horse and the cold and the crow had stopped calling, and the world was very quiet. I had lived my whole life with no fixed place and had thought for a long time that this was simply the shape of my life, that some men were made for roots, and some men were made for the road, and I was the second kind. I still thought that was largely true. But I stood in that yard with the cold in my bad ribs, and a small girl with silver-gray eyes behind a farmhouse door, and a woman inside who made coffee early before everyone else, and said my name like a door being opened. And I thought that maybe the shape of a man's life is not entirely settled until it settles. Rourke said over breakfast, "I could use a man who knows horses. Can you take a fence line?" I said, "I can take a fence line." He said, "North Pasture needs it before hard freeze." I said, "I'll start today." He nodded. He passed the bread. He said, "Pay's not generous, but it's fair." I said, "Fair's enough." He looked at me for a moment with the look of a man who has assessed something and found it adequate. Then he went back to his eggs. That was that. I spent that day and the next 3 on the north fence line and got it done before the freeze came. My ribs complained and I worked around them. Nebraska fence work in November is cold, straightforward, and satisfying in the specific way of tasks where you can see the progress every hour. Posts plumb and solid in the frozen ground, wire tight, staples set flush. I have always been able to lose myself in good plain work, and this was good plain work. And by the end of the first day I had done 200 yards, and my ribs had settled into a steady ache that I could work inside of, and the cold air had scoured my head clean of garnet, and the Ridley Road house, and the logging chain, and all of it. That is what honest work does. It doesn't make you forget. It just gives you something to put in front of the memory so you're not staring directly at it. At the end of each day I came in and Rourke's wife, a woman named Eunice who was solid and capable and ran her household with quiet authority, put the meal on the table. Macy told me what she had learned that day. She was educating herself at a rate that suggested she found the world insufficient in its current pace of delivering information. And Nora passed the bread, and Rourke said little and I ate, and felt something that I did not have an immediate name for. I worked my way toward a name for it over those first weeks. It was not happiness exactly, or not only that. It was usefulness. The specific satisfaction of being needed by something, a farm, a fence, a child's bucket, and being adequate to the need. I had spent 30 years being adequate to the need of cattle operations and trail work, and I was good at those things, and they had given me a living and taken me places, but they had not given me this sense of a day's work mattering to specific people who would feel the difference of it. Rourke noticed the fence and said the morning after I finished it, "Good work." 2 words. From a man of his economy that was high praise, and I knew it, and he knew I knew it, and we moved on. In the evenings, I sometimes sat with Rourke by the stove, and he was a quiet man with no appetite for unnecessary talk, and that suited me fine. Sometimes Nora came in and read, while Rourke smoked his pipe, and I sharpened whatever needed sharpening. And on those evenings, the room had a quality that I recognized from other people's lives, but had never had occasion to feel in my own. The particular quality of people who have been through hard things separately, arriving in the same warm room and finding it sufficient. On the 5th evening, Nora came out to the room off the barn after supper. She knocked. When I opened the door, she had a book under her arm, and she said, "I thought if you wanted company." She held the book up. "I was going to read." I said, "Come in." She came in and sat in the one chair while I sat on the cot, and she read, and I sharpened a knife that didn't need sharpening very much, and the stove made its small sounds, and outside the first hard snow of winter was starting against the window. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. She turned pages, and I ran the whetstone, and the snow built on the sill, and the room was warm, and that was enough. After a while she said, without looking up from the book, "Macy asked me this morning if you were going to stay forever." I said, "What did you tell her?" She said, "I told her I thought so." I said, "Did she ask you why you thought so?" She said, "No." She said, "Good." She paused. She turned a page. She said, "She has a more direct relationship with what she wants than most people." I said, "She does." Nora looked up from the book. She looked at me across the small, warm space of that room off the barn with the snow at the window. Her face was what it always was, careful, straight, precise, but her eyes were not hiding anything. She said, "So do I." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you staying?" I said, "Yes." She nodded. She looked back at her book. I went back to the knife. The snow at the window was heavier now, starting to build on the sill, and the stove made the room warm enough, and outside the world was turning white and quiet. She said after a while, "You should get that tooth looked at. There's a dentist in Hadley." I said, "It's fine." She said, "It's not fine, you're eating on one side." I said, "I'll go next week." She said, "You'll go Tuesday." I said, "All right." The book lay open on her knee and the stove popped once and settled. She was watching the snow now. I watched her watching it. Her profile in the lamplight, the line of her jaw where it was slightly uneven from the old break, the way her hands lay in her lap with the book between them. I said, "Nora." She looked at me. I said, "I want you to know that I understand what it cost. Coming into that livery, asking about Macy in a town where I stopped. That took more than most people have." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I didn't have a choice." I said, "Everyone has a choice. Most people make the easier one." She held my eyes for a moment. Then she said very quietly, "So do you? You could have ridden past." I said, "I couldn't." She said, "I know." She said it like a thing confirmed, like a conclusion she'd reached days ago and was only now saying aloud. "That's why I said you'd stay." She went back to her book. I went back to the knife. The snow built on the sill and the room was warm, and outside the Nebraska winter was laying itself down across the world, covering everything, making the land simple and white and still. I had ridden into Garnet, Kansas, a man with $40 and no direction and no fixed place in any of it. I was riding out of it, in the direction that counts, with 2 ribs that would heal and a tooth I'd see about Tuesday, and a small girl who handed me things without being asked, and a woman who said my name like a door she'd decided to open. That is what I am trying to tell you. That is the whole of it.